Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be taking a relatively early look at how some of the new additions to the San Jose Sharks have done thus far in the 22-23 season. As we know, Mike Griot took over as new GM for the San Jose Sharks this past off-season, and it was a big question of whether he would go for the full rebuild or if he'd go for some sort of reset, and it was kind of a weird off-season. Some moves would point towards a rebuild, like the Brent Burns trade. Other moves, you're kind of left wondering how that could actually lead to some sort of rebuild. But in the end, Mike Grier brought in a lot of new faces to the San Jose Sharks roster, and let's evaluate how those players have played through the first dozen or so games of this season. Now, it should be very important to remember that when it comes to my grading system, it is essentially based on the expectations of those players coming into the year. For instance, if the Sharks were to trade for Connor McDavid somehow, and he put up 50 points in a particular year, he would get an F, even though if the Sharks were to trade for some sort of fourth liner, like a Pierre-Edouard Bellemare or something like that, and he were to put up 50 points, he'd probably get an A+, because 50 points for Bellemare would be amazing, while 50 points for McDavid would be a massive disappointment. So let's start off here with, of course, leading the way is Nico Sturm. No surprise here that he would have the highest grade of the Sharks newcomers. 14 games played, 5 goals, 1 assist for 6 points. So Nico Sturm, when he was originally picked up, I wasn't a huge fan of the move, not because I didn't like Nico Sturm as a player, but mostly because of his contract. $2 million for 3 years seemed like a lot to pay for a player who I thought would be like a pretty decent fourth liner. Usually you don't want to commit that much money to a fourth liner because fourth liners are usually the most replaceable type of players you could have on a roster. There's a lot of different moving parts, and usually league minimum is decent enough, or maybe 1 million, slightly more than that, to fill up a championship level fourth line. I mean, you take a look at the Colorado Avalanche just last year. Does their fourth line really make all that much money? Not really. And yet, Nico Sturm ends up not just being a pretty good fourth liner, but actually an extremely good fourth liner, where the Sharks, when they were going fourth line versus fourth line early on in the season, were constantly on the winning end of that matchup because of Nico Sturm's presence as the center. He was so impressive, in fact, that he actually ends up getting boosted up. His entire line pretty much gets boosted up to being the third line for the San Jose Sharks. And while Nico Sturm's performance did take a slight hit from going up the depth chart like that, he still ended up being a pretty solid third liner, and I would say worth that $2 million that they brought him in for. So I do think he has exceeded expectations pretty significantly, and even though right now over these past couple of games he's been stuck with 2 anchors on his feet with both Bonino and Luke Kunin, he has still put up a good enough performance for me to give him the grade of an A-. Second on this list is Svechnikov. Now, unlike Nico Sturm, who I expected to be an NHL player, to be like a fourth line center for the San Jose Sharks, Svechnikov I didn't even expect to be on the main roster, and I don't think that Mike Grier expected that either, considering they signed him to a 2-year deal. They were mostly expecting him to be a force with the Barracuda, and then maybe if there were like 2 injuries on the main roster, he could come up for a couple of games. But he was so impressive through training camp and preseason that David Quinn decided to put him on the fourth line with Nico Sturm, and it immediately paid dividends for them. He was very strong, found good chemistry with Nico Sturm, and eventually got that promotion, like I mentioned earlier, to that third line, where he was still playing rather well. Ends up with 11 games played, 2 goals, 3 assists, and 5 points. Now you may be wondering, why does Nico Sturm have 14 games played while Svechnikov only has 11? That's not because Svechnikov got an injury, but it's because for whatever reason, about 8 or so games into the season, David Quinn decided in his infinite wisdom to put Svechnikov on the first line with both Meier and Hertl. And when that inevitably didn't work out, because Svechnikov, no matter how solid he looked in the bottom 6, is not going to look that solid in the top 6, he ended up being a healthy scratch, and he has not played with the San Jose Sharks these past couple of games. And that, to me, is not going to bring down his grade at all. I still think that is just completely an incompetent type of choice from the Sharks head coach, unless there's some craziness going on behind the scenes that I couldn't possibly know about. And as such, I thought Svechnikov did a very strong job in his role. He definitely outperformed his expectations. And while I do think he kind of rode the coattails a bit of Nico Sturm, who really was the driving force on those couple of lines in the fourth line and the third line, Svechnikov still definitely pulled his weight to get a grade of a B. The next player on this list would be Steven Lorentz, and a kind of a throwaway type of player I felt when he was picked up in the Brent Burns trade. Usually when you took a look at that trade, you saw Brent Burns moving on to Carolina. The Sharks are retaining some of the salary, and you're expecting that the return is probably going to be very minimal. The Sharks did get Makiniemi, who was a decently solid AHL goaltender for themselves, and maybe he could pan out to be something over the next couple of years. But Lorentz definitely seemed just like a sort of throw-in roster type of player to fill up a contract slot and to get rid of a contract slot for the Hurricanes. And he has looked pretty decent. I expected him to be, a fourth liner who likely wouldn't play every single game for the San Jose Sharks, but I think he has slightly outperformed those expectations. 14 games played, 1 goal, 2 assists for 3 points, so of course his offensive numbers do not necessarily jump off of the page, but he was even so impressive early on that he got an opportunity on the second line. Now, similar with Svechnikov, that obviously didn't actually work out in any sort of long-term fashion, and so Lorentz has now found himself recently back on the fourth line where he absolutely does belong, but he seems to be, good for a chance here or there. He does a decent job of controlling things when he's on the ice. It's not as effective as the fourth line the Sharks had earlier on in the season when they had Nico Sturm there, but it's still rather solid, and as such, Steven Lorentz, in my opinion, has slightly outperformed expectations and gotten himself a C+. The next player on this list is Luke Kunin. 14 games played, 2 goals, 4 assists for 6 points. Now, obviously, when you take into account the move that brought Kunin to the San Jose Sharks, which was trading John Leonard as well as a third-round pick in this upcoming draft, it looks like a really terrible move and would probably get a significantly lower grade than this. But it's very important to remember that it is not Luke Kunin's fault that Mike Grier actually made this trade. And so the only thing I'm actually going to be evaluating for Luke Kunin is his actual on-ice performance, not any of, the contract or anything like that. So when it comes to Luke Kunin's performance, it was still rather disappointing. I mean, I wasn't expecting too many great things. I saw the statistics for Kunin coming over. He obviously looked like a guy who was going to take way too many penalties. It looked like a guy who wasn't going to be very good in his own zone, and that's essentially what the Sharks actually got from Luke Kunin. He is able to contribute here and there offensively, but when it comes to actually sort of controlling the pace of the game when he is on the ice, he is just an absolute offensive possession black hole. He, of all of the sort of regular Sharks players, so not counting a player like Scott Harrington, he has the absolute worst possession numbers on the entire team. It's very, very ugly to look at. And the thing is that Kunin had opportunities higher up in the lineup. He played a handful of games with both Meier and Hertl, and you may say, well, that only lasted a couple of games. The Sharks have only played 14 games on the season, which means about 20% of the season here thus far, Kunin was on that top line. And so the fact that he has such awful possession numbers makes it look even uglier than if he was just sitting on the third line with like Nick Bonino the entire time dragging him down. Kunin himself is just a second Nick Bonino, essentially, who is dragging the entire third line down, and that is really making it a big issue for the San Jose Sharks, where Nico Sturm is like the only good player on that line in particular. And so while Kunin is able to contribute occasionally offensively on the power play and at even strength, finds himself in decent positions sometimes, which does help keep his grades slightly elevated, his defensive play leaves a lot to be desired. His penalties are way too costly for the San Jose Sharks, and as such, he ends up with the grade of a C-. Next on the list is Matt Benning. 14 games played, 1 goal, 2 assists for 3 points. Obviously not really expected to be any sort of offensive powerhouse. Matt Benning definitely won the award for the weirdest contract signed this offseason, but like I mentioned with Kunin, that's not really what we're going to be evaluating here. But coming into this season, I expected Matt Benning to potentially even be the Sharks' third best defenseman, and that's not because I thought so highly of Benning, but mostly because I thought very low of the rest of the Sharks' defensemen. I didn't really think Vlasic, Shemek, or Megna would necessarily be that much better than Benning, if at all. And so even though Benning to me was like a third pairing defenseman, that seemed like sadly to be the Sharks' third best player. And yet thus far this season, that has definitely not been the case. Matt Benning's underlying numbers are not necessarily terrible, but I think that is thanks to him being paired with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who has had a pretty big resurgence this season. Honestly, I don't think it's super controversial to say, though it might be, to say that Vlasic has been the Sharks' second best defenseman thus far. No offense to Mario Ferraro, but Vlasic has looked to me relatively solid in that particular role, and I think Benning has been benefiting from his partner being significantly better than expected. But when it comes to Benning's actual play, just based on the eye test, the guy is just not particularly good. There's way too many odd defensive zone breakdowns for him. He gets walked constantly by players coming the other way. He doesn't skate particularly fast. He's not a fast player. He's not a very smart player in his own zone either. Constantly comes into the Brent Burns type of situation where when a play gets a bit too hectic, he ends up just watching the puck and completely missing assignments. And so Benning has not been particularly good at all. I don't think his grade should be terrible because his underlying stats, like I said, are not awful. And the fact that his expectations weren't particularly high either. I mean, I thought he'd be a third pairing defenseman, and he's been a slightly bad third pairing defenseman just based off of performance. And the fact that, of course, he is a second pairing defenseman for the Sharks, unfortunately, because the Sharks have no better options, makes him look a lot worse. That's not technically his fault, and it's more so just the way that the lineup has been constructed. So generally, Matt Benning, it's been bad, but it's not necessarily awful, and as such, I give him the grade of a C-. And then finally on this list, the last player here, we have Oskar Lindblom. Now, when I was originally coming up with this list of players, I was going, okay, obviously Sturm has to be at the top. Svechnikov there can be second. Matt Benning will probably be right at the bottom. And then it actually took me a few moments to even remember that Lindblom was on the team as a whole, because he has been absolutely positively the most forgettable player for the San Jose Sharks this season. It's actually just kind of sad. 13 games played, 3 assists scored only, primarily playing in the bottom 6, though he did get some opportunities with some of the Sharks' top players at times through a few games, and Lindblom has just done absolutely nothing. Now, the reason that his grade is not a complete failure, literally, is because he also hasn't necessarily been a liability for the San Jose Sharks. I don't think that they get completely dominated when he is on the ice like they do, like Luke Kunin when he is on the ice, but still, Lindblom came into this season with decently high expectations. He was expected to be like a solid bottom 6 type of performer who could even flex into the top 6 if necessary, and he has done absolutely nothing of that. I mean, if we were to compare him to the recently left Rudolfs Balcers, who got bought out with a $1.5 million contract, 1 year left on that. Lindblom is making $1 million more for an extra year. Lindblom is still signed going into next year. Even if Rudolf Balcers was putting up 3 assists in 13 games, Balcers was at the very least, contributing here or there where you noticed him in particular games, and maybe he was just slightly snake-bitten. Like, I don't even remember the last time Oskar Lindblom actually got a decent chance. Like, he's essentially just completely invisible, which is a massive disappointment in my eyes, because I really did hope that this player could at least be like a 30, 35 type of point guy. Maybe he could get a few games into the top 6, potentially, kind of like a Kevin Labanc style of situation. But Lindblom is not looking anything more than like 4th line stapled at this point, and potentially even just healthy scratch, because at the very least a player like Jona Gadjevich is like getting into it physically and like even has a couple of decent offensive chances here or there. Lindblom is not getting into it physically. He's not getting any decent offensive chances. He's completely invisible. He's not doing anything. The only good thing, like I mentioned, is that he's also not doing anything terribly for the San Jose Sharks. He's not actively making them lose, but it's essentially like the Sharks are dressing 11 forwards every night, and Lindblom is doing absolutely nothing. And so definitely the biggest disappointment of the additions here from the San Jose Sharks, and he gets the grade of very close to an F, but not exactly an F, of a D-. But that will do it for this video. Clearly, the additions by Mike Grier have not been mostly positive, and this is just evaluating their on-ice play. Obviously, if you take into account Kunin's contract and the move that brought him here, Benning's contract, Lindblom's contract, the moves definitely look a lot worse. But at the very least, he did find a couple of decent players, or at least he found Nico Sturm, which was definitely quite nice to give the Sharks a solid bottom six type of center player, which they were hoping to get from Nick Bonino, but that obviously didn't end up working out. So generally, the moves haven't been very good, but at least there's a couple decent ones. Class dismissed.